I should have kept walking that night, should have let the fog swallow the sounds of a stranger's pain and continued toward the one chance I would ever have at a different life. But I have learned, in the years since, that the choices which unmake us are also the ones that reveal who we truly are. The evening of November the 14th, 1867, began with hope so fragile I barely dared to breathe upon it. I stood before the small, spotted mirror in my rented room above the tailor's shop on Merton Street, adjusting the borrowed dress that Mrs. Pemberton had lent me with trembling hands and whispered prayers. It was not a fine gown by any measure of society's standards. The pale blue silk had been mended twice at the bodice, and the lace at the sleeves had yellowed with age. But it was the finest thing I had ever worn, and in the dim candlelight I allowed myself to imagine that I looked almost like a lady. The room around me offered little encouragement to such fantasies. It was small and sparsely furnished, with walls that had once been white, but had faded to the color of old parchment. The window looked out onto a narrow courtyard where laundry hung on lines like surrendered flags, and the floorboards creaked with every step, announcing my presence to the seamstress who lived below. I had occupied this room for 3 years since my father's death, and I knew every crack in the ceiling, every stain on the threadbare rug, every draft that crept through the ill-fitting window frame on cold nights like this one. But tonight, I allowed myself to dream of something different. Tomorrow, I would stand in the grand Aether hall alongside 11 other young women of modest birth, and the gentlemen of the Progressive Scientific Society would observe us through their strange instruments, measuring the luminescence of our vital essences, determining which of us might be compatible for bonding with their unmarried members. It was a radical notion, this idea that marriages could be formed not through family arrangement or fortune, but through the scientific harmony of souls. The traditionalists called it blasphemy. The Church condemned it as tampering with God's design. But for women like me, daughters of failed tradesmen with no dowry and no connections, it represented something that had never before existed in the rigid world of Victorian England. Possibility. My father had been a clockmaker of modest skill and immodest dreams. He had believed, until his final breath, that he would create a timepiece so perfect, so revolutionary, that it would earn him a place among the great inventors of our age. Instead, he had earned only debts, and when the consumption took him 3 years past, he left me nothing but his tools, his unfinished mechanisms, and a reputation for eccentricity that made respectable employment difficult to obtain. I had survived by taking in mending, by copying documents for a solicitor who paid poorly and looked at me in ways that made my skin crawl, by eating less than I should and hoping more than I had any right to. And then, 6 weeks ago, the letter had arrived. I had been selected, through some mysterious process I did not fully understand, as a candidate for the collective bonding ceremony. Someone had submitted my name. Someone had vouched for my character. I never learned who, though I suspected Mrs. Pemberton, who had known my mother and who believed, despite all evidence, that I was destined for something greater than poverty and obscurity. The ceremony would begin at precisely 9 o'clock the following morning. The doors of the Grand Aether Hall would open at 8 and close at past, and no latecomer would be admitted under any circumstances. The scientific instruments required absolute calibration, the letter had explained, and even a single disruption could compromise the readings for all participants. I had read those words so many times that I could recite them from memory. I had planned my route with obsessive care, calculating exactly how long it would take to walk from Merton Street to the hall on Cavendish Square, accounting for weather and traffic and every possible delay. What I had not accounted for was the sound I heard as I stepped out into the November fog to walk to Mrs. Pemberton's house, where I would spend the night so that I might leave early the next morning with her blessing and her borrowed dress. It was a sound like metal grinding against metal, accompanied by a groan so deep and pained that it seemed to rise from the cobblestones themselves. I stopped at the mouth of the alley beside the tailor's shop, my heart hammering against my ribs, every instinct screaming at me to keep walking, to ignore whatever suffering was occurring in that narrow darkness, to think only of myself and my future and the ceremony that would change everything. But I have never been able to walk past suffering. It is perhaps my greatest flaw, this inability to harden my heart when hardness would serve me better. My mother had been the same way, giving away bread when we had little enough for ourselves, sitting with dying neighbors when she should have been resting her own failing body. She had called it Christian charity. My father had called it foolishness. I had always thought it was simply the way I was made, as involuntary as breathing, as impossible to suppress as the beating of my own heart. I turned into the alley. The fog was thicker there, trapped between the close brick walls, and the single gas lamp at the far end provided only the faintest illumination. I could make out a shape on the ground, a dark mass that resolved itself as I drew closer, into the form of a man. He was lying on his side, his back pressed against the wall, one arm wrapped around his midsection in a posture of desperate protection. His coat was torn, and even in the dimness I could see that something was wrong with the exposed flesh beneath it, something that glinted with an unnatural sheen. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, are you injured?" The man's head turned toward me, and I caught a glimpse of a face half hidden by shadow and something else, something that looked almost like a mask, but moved with his expressions as living flesh would move. His eyes were unmistakably human, pale and bright with pain and something that might have been fear or might have been warning. "Go," he said, and his voice had a strange quality to it, a faint harmonic undertone that made me think of my father's music boxes. "Leave this place. It is not safe." "You are bleeding," I said, because I could see it now, the dark wetness spreading across his waistcoat, dripping onto the cobblestones with a sound like slow rain. "I cannot leave you here to die." He laughed at that, a harsh sound that ended in a cough. "I am not certain I can die," he said. "At least, not in the way you mean." I did not understand his words then. I would come to understand them later, when I had learned the truth of what he was and what had been done to him. But in that moment, all I knew was that a man was injured and alone, and that the fog was growing thicker, and the night was growing colder, and that somewhere, in the darkness beyond the alley, I could hear footsteps that did not sound friendly. I knelt beside him, heedless of the mud and the blood that would ruin my only pair of decent shoes, and I took his hand. His fingers were cold, far colder than they should have been, and when I pressed my own fingers to the inside of his wrist, I felt not the steady rhythm of a pulse, but something else, something mechanical, a ticking like a tiny clock buried beneath his skin. I should have recoiled. I should have screamed and fled and told myself that I had imagined it, that the fog and the fear had conspired to create a hallucination. Instead, I held his hand more tightly and said, "I am going to help you. Can you stand if I support you?" He stared at me for a long moment, his strange eyes searching my face as though looking for something he did not expect to find. "You do not know what I am," he said. "I know that you are hurt," I replied. "The rest does not matter." Those words, spoken in ignorance and innocence, would prove to be more prophetic than I could have imagined. But I did not know that then. I only knew that I could not leave him, that something in his eyes spoke to something in my heart, that I had already made my choice the moment I turned into that alley. It took nearly an hour to get him to his feet and guide him through the back streets to a small church I knew, where the elderly rector asked no questions and provided a pallet near the fire and clean cloths for bandaging. I stayed until I was certain he would not die in the night, if indeed he could die at all, and by the time I emerged into the gray pre-dawn light, I knew with sickening certainty that I had missed my chance. The Grand Aether Hall was 3 miles from the church. The ceremony had begun at 9. It was now 10:30, and when I arrived at last, breathless and mud-stained and still wearing my borrowed dress, The great brass doors were closed and locked, and a porter informed me with cold politeness that no latecomers could be admitted under any circumstances. I stood on the steps of that magnificent building, watching the fog curl around the gas lamps like grasping fingers, and I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to mourn the future I had lost. Then I wiped my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and began the long walk back to Merton Street and the life of poverty and obscurity that would now be my permanent home. The stranger was gone from the church when I passed by to return Mrs. Pemberton's dress. The rector told me that a black carriage had come for him in the night, that men in livery had carried him out without a word of explanation, that he had left nothing behind but a few drops of something that looked like oil mixed with blood. I told myself it did not matter, that I would never see him again, that he was merely a strange episode in a life that had now returned to its ordinary misery. I was wrong. The following evening, as I sat in my cold room attempting to repair a torn petticoat by the light of a single candle, I heard the sound of carriage wheels stopping in the street below. This was not unusual. The street was narrow but well-trafficked, and carriages often stopped to discharge passengers at the various shops and boarding houses. But something made me rise and go to the window, some instinct I could not name, and when I looked down I saw a vehicle unlike any I had ever seen before. It was black, polished to such a high shine that it seemed to absorb the light of the street lamps rather than reflect it. The horses that drew it were black as well, enormous creatures with braided manes and silver fittings on their harnesses. But it was the crest on the carriage door that made my breath catch in my throat. Even from my high window, I could make out the design. A pair of interlocking gears beneath a ducal coronet, rendered in gold leaf that gleamed like captured sunlight. I knew that crest. Everyone in London knew that crest. It belonged to the Duke of Ashworth, the man the newspapers called the Clockwork Duke, the most mysterious and feared aristocrat in all of England. The carriage door opened and a footman descended, followed by a figure I recognized with a shock that made me grip the windowsill for support. It was him, the stranger from the alley, but he was transformed. Where he had been broken and bleeding, he was now upright and commanding. Where his face had been half hidden in shadow, it was now clearly visible in the lamplight, and I could see what I had only glimpsed before. The left side of his face was not flesh at all, but a seamless integration of bronze and steel, crafted with such artistry that it moved with his expressions as naturally as living skin. His left eye, too, was mechanical, a lens of pale blue glass that seemed to glow faintly from within. He looked up at my window, and though it was impossible that he could see me in the darkness of my unlit room, I felt his gaze lock onto mine with an intensity that made my heart stutter. The footman approached the door of the building, and moments later I heard heavy boots ascending the stairs, heard a knock at my door that was more command than request. I opened it to find not the footman but the Duke himself, standing in my narrow hallway, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire space, his mismatched eyes fixed on my face with an expression I could not read. "Miss Eleanor Ashford," he said, and his voice was the same as I remembered, that strange harmonic undertone beneath the words, but stronger now, more controlled. "You are the woman who saved my life last night." It was not a question. I found my voice with difficulty. "I do not believe I saved your life, Your Grace. You yourself said you were not certain you could die." Something flickered across his face, an expression that might have been surprise or might have been amusement. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything," I said, and it was true. Every detail of that night was etched into my memory with the clarity of an engraving, the sound of his pain, the feel of his cold hand in mine, the ticking beneath his skin that had not repulsed me as it should have. He studied me for a long moment, and I became acutely aware of my surroundings, the poverty of my room visible through the open door behind me, the shabbiness of my dress, the inkstains on my fingers from the copying work I had been doing that afternoon. I waited for the contempt I had seen so often in the eyes of my betters, The dismissal, the curl of the lip that would precede some coldly polite farewell. Instead, he said, "You missed the Aether bonding because of me." I did not know how he knew about the ceremony, about my candidacy, about all that I had lost by turning into that alley. Perhaps he had made inquiries. Perhaps he had access to records and registries that common people could not obtain. Perhaps he simply knew things, as men of power and mystery so often seem to know things. "Yes," I said, because there was no point in denying it. "And yet you stayed with me. You could have left me there and arrived in time. You could have achieved everything you had hoped for. Why did you stay?" I thought about lying. I thought about telling him some noble platitude about Christian charity and the duty of one human being to another. But something in his eyes, in the way he stood perfectly still awaiting my answer, made me tell the truth instead. "Because I could not bear to leave you suffering," I said. "Because something in your eyes made me feel that you were worth saving. Because I have never been able to walk past someone in pain, no matter what it costs me." He was silent for so long that I began to fear I had offended him, that my honesty had been too presumptuous, that he would turn and leave and I would never know why he had come. But then he spoke, and his voice was different, softer, as though some rigid mechanism within him had eased by a fraction. "I came to repay my debt," he said, "but I find that I do not know how. What can a man like me offer to a woman who gave up her future for a stranger? I should have asked for money. I should have asked for employment, for a reference, for some practical advantage that would improve my circumstances. But the words that came out of my mouth surprised even me. "Tell me your name," I said. "Not your title. Your name." His human eye widened slightly, and I saw his mechanical eye adjust its focus, the tiny gears whirring almost imperceptibly. "No one has asked me that in years," he said. "I am asking now." Another long pause. Then quietly, as though the word cost him something to speak, he said, "Edmund." "Edmund," I repeated, and the name felt strange and precious on my tongue, like a secret I had been entrusted to keep. "I am pleased to meet you, Edmund." And then, impossibly, the Clockwork Duke smiled. It was not a broad smile, not an easy expression of joy. It was a small thing, tentative, as though his face had forgotten how to form such shapes and was only now remembering. But it transformed him. For a moment he looked almost human, almost whole, almost like a man who had not been broken and rebuilt into something neither flesh nor machine. "I have a proposal for you, Miss Ashford," he said. "Not the kind you missed yesterday. Something else. Something that may be more dangerous, but also more interesting." I should have refused. I should have thanked him for his visit and closed my door and returned to my safe, small, impoverished life. But I had already proven, by turning into that alley, that I was not a woman who chose the safe path. "I am listening," I said. And so my story truly began. The Duke's carriage was even more remarkable on the inside than it was on the outside. The seats were upholstered in black velvet so soft it seemed to absorb my fingers when I touched it. The walls were paneled in dark wood inlaid with patterns of brass that I recognized, with a start, as schematic diagrams for clockwork mechanisms. Small gas lamps hung at each corner, their flames burning with an unusual blue tint that I would later learn was produced by ether-infused fuel. And everywhere, there was the faint sound of ticking, as though the carriage itself were alive with hidden mechanisms. Edmund sat across from me, his posture rigidly correct, his hands resting on his knees with unnatural stillness. I had the impression that he was working very hard to appear at ease, that beneath his calm exterior there were calculations and adjustments constantly taking place, a conscious effort to mimic the natural movements of a fully human body. "I should explain what I am," he said, as the carriage began to move. "What was done to me, so that you may make your decision with full knowledge." I nodded, though part of me wanted to say that I had already made my decision, that I had made it the moment I took his hand in that dark alley, that nothing he told me would change the fact that I was now irreversibly committed to this strange path. 7 years ago, he began, I was a soldier, a captain in Her Majesty's forces stationed in the Crimea. There was an explosion. A shell struck the building where my company was sheltered. When they pulled me from the rubble, half my body was destroyed beyond any surgeon's ability to repair. He paused, and I saw his mechanical hand clench slightly, the tiny gears in his knuckles clicking softly. I should have died, he continued. By every law of medicine and nature, I should have died. But my family had resources, and they had connections, and they had heard of a man, a scientist who was conducting experiments that no respectable institution would sanction. His name was Dr. Aldous Crane, and he believed that the human body could be repaired, even replaced, with clockwork mechanisms powered by refined ether. Ether, I said. The same substance used in the bonding ceremonies? The same, Edmund confirmed. Ether is the fifth element, the vital essence that animates all living things. Dr. Crane theorized that it could also animate mechanical constructs, that the boundary between flesh and metal was not as absolute as we believed. He had experimented on animals, on cadavers, on willing subjects who did not survive the process. I was to be his greatest test. And you survived, I said. I survived. He looked down at his hands, one flesh and one metal, both perfectly still. I was rebuilt. My left arm, my left leg, portions of my torso, half my face, one eye, one lung, one kidney, part of my spine, all replaced with clockwork mechanisms of Dr. Crane's design, animated by a core of concentrated ether implanted where my heart should be. I tried to imagine it, the pain of such a reconstruction, the horror of waking to find oneself transformed into something new and strange. Do you feel pain? I asked. Do you feel anything at all? I feel everything, Edmund said, and there was a weight in his voice that made me ache for him. That is the curse of it, Miss Ashford. I was told that the mechanical parts would be numb, that I would lose sensation in half my body. But Dr. Crane's work was too skilled, too precise. The clockwork integrates with my nervous system. I feel the cold of the metal against my bones. I feel the turning of every gear. I feel the pressure of the ether as it pulses through my artificial veins. And I feel, he hesitated, other things. Things I was told I would no longer be capable of feeling. Loneliness, sorrow, longing. He looked at me then, and in his human eye I saw something raw and vulnerable, something that made me want to reach across the space between us and take his hand as I had done in the alley. For 7 years, he continued, I have lived as a recluse. The scientific community hails me as a miracle. The church condemns me as an abomination. Society fears me because they do not know what I am or what I am capable of. I have been called a monster, a marvel, a harbinger of humanity's future, and a warning of its damnation. And through it all, I have been alone. Until last night, I said softly. Until last night, he agreed. When a woman I had never met knelt in the mud beside me and held my hand and told me that what I was did not matter, only that I was hurt. Do you understand, Miss Ashford, how extraordinary that was? Do you understand what it meant to me? I did not trust my voice to answer. I simply looked at him, at this strange and beautiful and broken man, and I felt something shift in my chest, some barrier that I had not known existed beginning to crack. The carriage rattled over a rough patch of cobblestones, and Edmund glanced out the window at the passing streets. We are nearly there, he said. I should tell you about the proposal before we arrive. Please, I said. Last night I was attacked, he said. The men who assaulted me were not common thieves. They knew what I was. They had tools designed specifically to damage my mechanisms, to extract the ether core from my body. They wanted to take me apart, Miss Ashford, to study my construction, to learn the secrets of my creation. Who would do such a thing? I asked. That is what I intend to discover. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent on my face. There is a conspiracy, Miss Ashford. A group of individuals who believed that the technology used to create me should be controlled, monopolized, perhaps weaponized. I have suspected their existence for some time, but last night's attack confirmed it. They are growing bolder. They will try again, and I find that I cannot face them alone. You want my help? I was astonished. Your Grace, I am a seamstress and a copyist. I have no skills that would be of use in such an investigation. On the contrary, Edmund said, you have precisely the skills I need. You are intelligent, you are observant. You noticed details about my condition last night that most people would have been too frightened or too disgusted to perceive. You are unknown in society, which means you can move in circles where I cannot without attracting attention. And most importantly, he paused, his voice dropping lower. You are not afraid of me. I considered his words as the carriage slowed and stopped. Through the window, I could see the gates of an enormous estate, wrought iron worked into patterns of gears and cogs, opening silently to admit us. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. I am proposing an employment, Edmund said. You will live in my house as my assistant. Your duties will include helping me investigate this conspiracy, accompanying me to social functions where I need an ally, and he hesitated again, talking to me. Simply talking to me, as you are doing now, without fear or revulsion. In return, I will provide you with a salary, a comfortable room, and the protection of my name. It is not what the ether bonding would have given you, but it is what I have to offer. I looked out at the estate as the carriage passed through the gates. The house that rose before us was magnificent and strange, a sprawling Gothic structure of gray stone, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the cloudy sky. But it was not the architecture that struck me most forcefully. It was the details, the gargoyles on the corners that were not mythical beasts, but mechanical owls with glass eyes that seemed to watch our approach. The garden hedges trimmed into the shapes of cogwheels and springs. The fountain in the center of the circular drive, where water flowed not downward, but upward, defying gravity through some mechanism I could not fathom. This is Ashworth House, Edmund said. It has been my prison for 7 years. Perhaps with your help, it can become something else. I made my decision in that moment, though I suspect I had made it long before, in an alley in Whitechapel, when I first took a stranger's cold hand in mine. I will stay, I said. I will help you. But I have one condition. Name it. I looked directly into his eyes, one human and one mechanical, both watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. You must promise to tell me the truth, I said. Whatever we discover, whatever secrets we uncover, you must not hide them from me. I will not be your servant or your pawn. I will be your partner in this, or I will be nothing at all. Edmund stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended his mechanical hand, the brass fingers gleaming in the dim light of the carriage. I give you my word, Miss Ashford, complete honesty in all things. I took his hand. The metal was cold against my palm, but I did not flinch. This was the second time I had touched him, and like the first, it felt significant, a crossing of some invisible threshold from which there was no return. Then we have an agreement, I said, and please, call me Eleanor. Another of those small, surprised smiles crossed his face. Eleanor, he repeated, and the sound of my name in his strange, harmonic voice sent a shiver down my spine that was not entirely unpleasant. The carriage came to a stop before the great doors of Ashworth House, and I stepped out into my new life, with my hand still clasped in the cold fingers of the Clockwork Duke. The interior of Ashworth House was a marvel of contradictions. The entrance hall was cavernous and grand, with a sweeping staircase of dark marble and walls hung with ancestral portraits in gilded frames. But woven through this traditional elegance were elements that belonged to no conventional aristocratic home. Brass pipes running along the corners of the ceiling, emitting soft hisses of steam. Clockwork automata standing in niches where statues should have been. their glass eyes following our movements with uncanny attention, and everywhere that faint ticking that I was beginning to associate with Edmund himself, as though the house were an extension of his mechanical body. The servants who greeted us were few in number, but impeccably trained. A butler named Graves, whose expression was so carefully neutral that I wondered if he too might be partially mechanical. A housekeeper named Mrs. Blackwood, who looked at me with sharp eyes and tighter lips, but said nothing beyond a formal welcome. A handful of footmen and maids who moved through the shadows of the house like ghosts, rarely seen and never heard. "Your rooms are in the east wing," Edmund told me as he led me up the staircase. "I have taken the liberty of having some basic necessities provided, but we can send for anything else you require." My rooms, I discovered, were larger and more luxurious than any space I had ever occupied. A sitting room with a fireplace already crackling with warmth. A bedchamber with a four-poster bed hung with green velvet curtains. A dressing room with a wardrobe that stood empty, waiting to be filled. And most astonishingly, a private study with a desk and bookshelves and a window overlooking the strange mechanical garden below. "This is too much," I said, overwhelmed. "It is what you deserve," Edmund replied. He was standing in the doorway of the sitting room, watching me take in my new surroundings. "You gave up everything for a stranger. The least I can do is ensure you are comfortable while you help me unravel this conspiracy." I turned to face him, this man who was both more and less than human, who had upended my life in the space of a single night. "I have so many questions," I said, "and I will answer them all in time." He inclined his head in a gesture that was almost a bow. "But it is late, and you have had an extraordinary day. Rest now. Tomorrow I will show you everything, tell you everything. Tomorrow we begin." He withdrew, closing the door softly behind him, and I was left alone in my magnificent new prison, surrounded by luxuries I had never dreamed of possessing, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation and something else, something I did not yet have a name for. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with images of clockwork hearts and ticking hands and a pair of mismatched eyes watching me from the darkness. When I woke, the gray light of a November dawn was filtering through my curtains, and I could hear the soft footsteps of servants in the corridor outside. A maid brought me breakfast on a tray, along with a note written in a precise, angular hand. "When you are ready, come to the library. We have much to discuss." It was signed simply E. The library was on the ground floor of the West Wing, and it took me nearly 10 minutes to find it, wandering through corridors that seemed to shift and change direction when I was not looking. The house, I was beginning to realize, was not merely decorated with clockwork. It was built with clockwork, its very structure animated by hidden mechanisms that served purposes I could not fathom. When I finally found the right door and pushed it open, I was greeted by a sight that stole my breath. The library was enormous, stretching up through 3 full stories of the house, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books and scrolls and strange instruments. Brass ladders on rails allowed access to the upper shelves, and scattered throughout the space were tables covered with papers and diagrams and mechanical components in various stages of assembly. At the center of the room, before a fireplace large enough to stand in, Edmund sat in a high-backed chair, a book open in his lap, his mechanical eye glowing faintly in the dim light. "Good morning." "Eleanor," he said, looking up as I entered. "I hope you slept well." "I slept," I said, which was not quite the same thing. He smiled at that, a slightly larger smile than I had seen from him before. "Please sit." He gestured to a chair across from his. "We have a great deal to discuss, and I find that I am anxious to begin." I settled into the chair he indicated, smoothing my skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. "Where shall we start?" "At the beginning, I suppose." He closed his book and set it aside. "You know the broad outlines of my story. A soldier wounded in war, rebuilt with clockwork and ether by a brilliant and reckless scientist. But there are details I did not share last night. details that are relevant to our investigation. I am listening. Edmund was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Dr. Aldous Crane was not working alone, he said at last. He had patrons, wealthy and powerful men who funded his research in exchange for the promise of future benefits. They called themselves the Prometheus Society, after the Titan who stole fire from the gods. They believed that Aether technology represented the next great leap in human evolution, that those who controlled it would control the future of civilization itself. And they funded your reconstruction? They funded it, they observed it, they documented every aspect of the procedure. He paused, and I saw his mechanical hand clench and release in what I was beginning to recognize as a gesture of suppressed emotion. I was their proof of concept, Eleanor. Their demonstration that a man could be rebuilt, enhanced, transformed into something more than human. But I was never meant to be the end of their ambitions. I was only the beginning. What did they intend? An army, Edmund said, his voice flat. They wanted to create an army of soldiers like me, men who could not be killed by conventional weapons, who did not tire or falter, who could be repaired and returned to battle within hours of being damaged. They brought their proposal to the crown, and for a time it seemed that they would succeed. What stopped them? I did. He met my eyes, and I saw something fierce and determined in his gaze. When I learned what they intended, I destroyed Dr. Crane's notes. I sabotaged his laboratory. I made it impossible for them to replicate the process that had created me. And in doing so, I made myself their enemy. The attacks, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. They want to take you apart so they can learn how to rebuild you. Precisely. Edmund rose from his chair and began to pace before the fireplace, his movements a mixture of mechanical precision and human restlessness. For 7 years they have tried to acquire me through other means. Legal challenges to my inheritance, social pressure to force me into isolation, attempts to bribe or threaten my servants into betraying my secrets. But I have resisted, and their patience has finally run out. Last night's attack was only the first. There will be others. And you want me to help you find them before they find you. I want more than that. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression intent. I want to destroy them, Eleanor. I want to expose their conspiracy to the world and ensure that no one else is ever subjected to what was done to me. But I cannot do it alone. I need someone I can trust, someone who sees me as more than a machine or a monster. Why me? I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since the moment he appeared at my door. Of all the people in London, why choose me? Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "Because when you looked at me in that alley, you did not see a freak or an abomination. You saw a man in pain. And when you held my hand, you did not flinch from the metal, did not recoil from the cold. You simply held on, as though you were trying to anchor me to the world." I felt heat rising to my cheeks and looked away, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. I only did what anyone would have done. "No," Edmund said. "You did what no one else has ever done. And that is why I trust you, Eleanor. That is why I believe that together we might actually succeed." The weeks that followed were the most extraordinary of my life. Edmund was true to his word, hiding nothing from me, sharing every detail of his history and his suspicions and his fears. We spent hours in the library, poring over documents and diagrams, piecing together the names and connections of the Prometheus Society's members. We took walks through the mechanical garden, where Edmund explained the principles of Aether technology in terms simple enough for me to understand, showing me how the strange blue light powered the fountains that defied gravity and animated the brass owls that watched over the estate. On some afternoons, when the weather permitted, we would venture beyond the grounds of Ashworth House, walking through the surrounding countryside that stretched away from London's sprawl. Edmund moved more freely here, away from the curious stares of city dwellers, and I began to see a different side of him, lighter, more playful, as though the open air and the absence of judgment allowed him to breathe more easily. He told me stories during these walks, stories of his life before the war, before the explosion that had changed everything. He had been a different man then, carefree and optimistic, the youngest son of a duke with no expectation of inheriting the title. He had joined the army not out of duty, but out of a genuine desire for adventure, believing that war was a glorious enterprise rather than the brutal horror he would come to know it as. "I was a fool," he said one day, as we walked along a path bordered by bare winter trees. "I thought I was invincible. I thought nothing could touch me, that I would come home covered in medals and glory, marry some suitable young woman, and live out my days in comfortable obscurity while my brother managed the estate. I never imagined that I would be the one to inherit. I never imagined that I would inherit as this." He gestured at himself, at the bronze and steel that gleamed beneath his coat, and I saw the familiar shadow of grief cross his face. "Your brother," I said. "What happened to him?" "He died," Edmund said quietly. "Typhoid fever 2 years after my reconstruction. He was everything I was not, responsible, steady, prepared to take on the burdens of the title. He should have lived. He should have been the one to carry on our family's name. Instead, he lies in the family crypt, and I, the broken one, the reconstructed one, am all that remains." I reached out and took his hand, the mechanical one, feeling the smooth brass warm slightly under my touch. "You are not broken," I said. "You are changed. There is a difference." He looked at me with something like wonder in his eyes. "You always know what to say," he murmured. "You always find the words that make me believe, even for a moment, that I am still human. You are human, Edmund. The humanity is not in the body, it is in the heart, in the soul, in the choices we make. And your choices have shown me more humanity than I have seen in 100 men with all their original parts." We shared meals in the small dining room reserved for private occasions, talking late into the night about everything and nothing, about philosophy and science and the nature of humanity. Edmund had read widely during his years of seclusion, devouring books on every subject from ancient history to modern physics, and his conversation was endlessly fascinating. But it was not his intellect that captivated me most. It was his gentleness, his unexpected humor, the way he listened when I spoke, as though my words were the most important sounds in the world. And slowly, gradually, I began to fall in love with him. It was not the sudden, overwhelming passion described in romantic novels. It was something quieter, deeper, a growing awareness of his presence that made my heart beat faster whenever he entered a room, a tenderness that welled up in me whenever I saw him struggle with some task that his mechanical parts made difficult, a longing that kept me awake at night, wondering what it would feel like to touch not just his metal hand but his flesh one, to trace the boundary where skin gave way to bronze. I knew it was impossible. I knew that society would never accept such a union, that the church would condemn it, that even if Edmund felt something for me in return, we could never be together in any conventional sense. But love, I was learning, does not concern itself with possibility. It simply is, as inevitable as gravity, as impossible to deny as the dawn. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks after my arrival at Ashworth House, I was sitting in my study, attempting to organize the notes I had taken during the day's research. The fire had burned low, and the room was growing cold, but I was too absorbed in my work to notice until a knock at the door startled me from my concentration. "Come in," I called, expecting a servant. But it was Edmund who entered, carrying a woolen shawl that I recognized as belonging to Mrs. Blackwood. "You forgot this in the library," he said, "and you are shivering." "I am quite warm," I began, but even as I spoke I realized he was right. My fingers were stiff with cold, and when I looked down at them, they were tinged faintly blue. Edmund crossed the room and draped the shawl around my shoulders, his movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, his hands rested on my shoulders, and I felt the contrast between them acutely, the warmth of flesh on one side and the coolness of metal on the other. "You work too hard," he said, his voice low. "I did not bring you here to exhaust yourself." "You brought me here to help you," I replied. "I am only doing what I promised." He did not move away. His hands remained on my shoulders, and I could hear the soft ticking of the mechanisms in his chest, a rhythm that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. "Eleanor," he said, and there was something different in his voice, something hesitant and vulnerable that I had rarely heard from him. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Coming here, choosing to help me, giving up the future you might have had at the bonding ceremony?" I turned in my chair to look at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he must be able to hear it. "Never," I said. "Not for a moment, even knowing what I am. Even knowing that I can never offer you a normal life?" I stood, and we were suddenly very close, close enough that I could see the tiny gears turning behind the glass of his mechanical eye, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from the human half of his body. "Edmund," I said, "what is a normal life?" I was destined for poverty and loneliness. The bonding ceremony might have saved me from that, but it would have matched me with a stranger, a man I did not choose, a man I might never have loved. Here with you, I have found something I never expected to find. And what is that? His voice was barely a whisper. "Purpose," I said. "Meaning." And something else, something I do not have the courage to name. His human eyes searched my face, and I saw in it a hope so fragile it made my chest ache. "Eleanor," he said, "I must tell you something. Something I have been trying to deny since the moment you took my hand in that alley." "Tell me," I whispered. "I love you." The words came out rough and broken, as though they had been trapped inside him for so long that they had rusted. I know I have no right to say it. I know I am not a man in any proper sense, that I am something neither human nor machine, something the world has never seen before and may never understand. But I love you, Eleanor Ashford. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you see me, truly see me, without flinching. And if you wish me to never speak of it again, I will respect your wishes. But I could not go another day without telling you the truth. I reached up and placed my hand against his cheek, the human one, feeling the warmth of his skin and the rough stubble of his jaw. "Edmund," I said, "do you remember what I told you in that alley? That what you are does not matter, only that you were hurt?" He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. You are the most extraordinary man I have ever known. You are brave and brilliant and good, and if your body is made partly of metal, that does not make you any less worthy of love. It only makes you unique." "Eleanor," he breathed. "I love you too," I said. "I have loved you since the moment I took your hand in the darkness, and I will go on loving you, whatever the world may think, whatever the future may hold." He kissed me then. His lips were warm, fully human, and they trembled against mine with an emotion I understood perfectly. It was not a practiced kiss, not the confident embrace of a man accustomed to romance. It was the kiss of someone who had believed himself incapable of being loved, discovering that he had been wrong all along. When we parted, we were both breathing unsteadily, and I could feel tears on my cheeks, though I could not have said when they had begun to fall. "This changes nothing about the danger we face," Edmund said quietly. "The Prometheus Society will not stop because we have found happiness. If anything, they may use you against me." "I know," I said, "but I would rather face danger with you than safety without you." His smile was radiant, transforming his half-mechanical face into something beautiful. "Then we face it together," he said. "Whatever comes." "Whatever comes," I agreed. But neither of us could have guessed what was coming. Neither of us could have known how soon our newfound happiness would be tested, or how high the price of our love would prove to be. The first sign of trouble came a week later, in the form of a letter. It arrived with the morning post, a cream-colored envelope addressed to me in an elegant hand. I did not recognize the writing, and when I opened it, I found a single sheet of paper bearing only a few lines of text. "Miss Ashford," it read, "you have made a dangerous enemy by aligning yourself with the Clockwork Duke, but there is still time to save yourself. Come to the Crescent Garden at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Come alone and tell no one. Your future depends upon it. A friend." I should have shown the letter to Edmund immediately. I should have trusted the partnership we had formed, the love we had confessed. But something in me hesitated. The letter had said to come alone. The letter had said to tell no one. And some foolish, curious part of me wanted to know who this friend was and what they wanted before I involved Edmund in what might be nothing more than a prank or a test. So at 2:30, I told Mrs. Blackwood that I was going for a walk in the park and slipped out of Ashworth House through a side door. Crescent Garden was a small public park about a mile from Edmund's estate, a quiet place favored by nursemaids and elderly gentlemen, seeking refuge from the bustle of the city. When I arrived, the paths were nearly empty, the cold weather having driven most people indoors. I walked slowly toward the center of the garden, where a fountain stood silent and still, its water turned off for the winter. A woman was waiting for me there. She was older than I, perhaps 40, with silver-streaked hair and a severe black gown that marked her as a widow or a woman in mourning. Her face was handsome but hard, and her eyes, when they met mine, were the pale blue of winter ice. "Miss Ashford," she said, "thank you for coming." "Who are you?" I asked. "What do you want with me?" "My name is Lady Rothmore," she said, "and what I want is to save you from the fate that awaits you if you continue down your current path. I do not know what you mean." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You are living in the house of a monster, Miss Ashford, a creature that was once a man, but is now something else entirely. And you are falling in love with him if you have not done so already. Do not deny it. I can see the truth in your face." I felt my cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. "My personal feelings are not your concern, my lady. On the contrary, they are very much my concern." Lady Rothmore stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I know what the Duke of Ashworth is. I know what was done to him and who did it. And I know that the men who created him will stop at nothing to reclaim their investment. You are caught in the middle of a war you do not understand, Miss Ashford, and if you do not extricate yourself soon, you will be destroyed along with him. Are you threatening me? I am warning you. There is a difference." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small card, which she pressed into my hand. "This is the address of a boarding house in Chelsea. The proprietress is a friend of mine. She will take you in, no questions asked, and help you find respectable employment far from London. Leave Ashworth House tonight. Leave before it is too late." I looked down at the card, then back at Lady Rothmore's cold, beautiful face. "Why would you help me?" I asked. "You do not know me. I know what it is to be a young woman with no resources, caught in a situation beyond her control." She turned away, her skirts rustling against the frozen grass. "Consider my offer, Miss Ashford, but do not consider it for long. Events are moving more quickly than you realize." She walked away, disappearing around a curve in the path, and I was left alone with the card in my hand and a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I did not go to the boarding house in Chelsea. I went back to Ashworth House and told Edmund everything. He listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, he rose from his chair and began to pace, his mechanical leg making a soft clicking sound against the parquet floor. "Lady Rothmore," he said. "I know that name. Her husband was one of the original members of the Prometheus Society. He died 3 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Do you think she is working with them?" "I do not know." She may be, or she may be working against them, trying to undermine their plans by isolating me. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his mismatched eyes bright with worry. What I do know is that you are no longer safe here, Eleanor. If they know about you, if they know how much you mean to me, they will use you as leverage. I will not leave you, I said. I am not asking you to leave. I am asking you to be careful. From now on, you go nowhere without an escort. You trust no one outside this house, and you tell me immediately if anyone else contacts you. He crossed to where I stood and took my hands in his, one warm and one cold. I cannot lose you, Eleanor. I have only just found you. I cannot bear to lose you now. You will not lose me, I promised. We will face this together, remember? Whatever comes. But even as I spoke the words, I felt a shadow of doubt creep into my heart. Lady Rothmore's warning had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I had known, intellectually, that Edmund was in danger, that I had placed myself in danger by agreeing to help him. But hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, had made it real in a way it had not been before. That night, I dreamed of gears and flames, of a great machine collapsing in on itself, of Edmund's voice calling my name from somewhere I could not reach. I woke gasping for breath, my nightgown soaked with sweat, and it was a long time before I could calm my racing heart enough to sleep again. The next blow came 3 days later, when the body was discovered in the garden. It was one of the mechanical owls, the gargoyle-like automatons that perched on the corners of the house. A gardener found it at dawn, lying in the frozen flower bed beneath the east tower, its glass eyes shattered and its brass body crumpled like paper. But that was not the worst of it. Tucked inside the owl's chest cavity, where its clockwork heart should have been, was a human finger. Edmund identified it immediately. It belonged to Dr. Aldous Crane. "The creator of my existence," Edmund said, his voice hollow with shock. "The man who gave me life. And someone has taken him apart, piece by piece, and left this for me to find." We called for the police, of course. An inspector named Harrow arrived, a thin, sharp-featured man with clever eyes and a reputation for solving cases that baffled his colleagues. He examined the scene with meticulous care, asked questions that probed without accusing, and promised to keep us informed of any developments. But Edmund and I both knew that the police would not be enough. Whoever had done this was sending a message, and the message was clear. We know where you live. We know what you value, and we can reach you whenever we choose. "It is a warning," Edmund said when the inspector had gone. "They want me to know that they have Crane, that they are torturing him for his secrets, and they want me to come to them, to exchange myself for his life." "You cannot do that," I said. "I know." He rubbed his human hand over his face, a gesture of exhaustion and despair. "Crane is not an innocent man, Eleanor. He built me without my consent, experimented on me like a laboratory animal, sold the rights to my body to men who wanted to use me as a weapon. But he is also the only person alive who fully understands how I was made. If they break him, if they learn his secrets, they will be able to create others like me." "Then we must find him first," I said. "We must find him and rescue him before they can extract what they need." Edmund looked at me with something like wonder in his eyes. "You would do that? Risk your life to save the man who created a monster?" "You are not a monster," I said firmly. "You are the man I love. And if saving Dr. Crane means saving you, then I will move heaven and earth to find him." A smile flickered across Edmund's face, there and gone like lightning. "I do not deserve you, Eleanor Ashford." "Perhaps not," I said, "but you have me nonetheless." We began our search that very night. Edmund had contacts in the scientific community, men and women who had worked with Crane or studied his methods, who might have heard rumors of his whereabouts. I had a different kind of resource: the servants, the shopkeepers, the invisible people who moved through the shadows of London and saw things that the quality never noticed. I had learned in my years of poverty how to talk to such people, how to earn their trust and their confidences. And now I put those skills to use. Within a week, we had pieced together a disturbing picture. Dr. Crane had not been abducted. He had gone willingly, lured by the promise of funding and resources to continue his work. The Prometheus Society had rebuilt itself in secret, gathering new members and new wealth, and they had offered Crane everything he had ever wanted: a laboratory of his own, unlimited supplies, and a new subject on which to experiment. But the subject was not a wounded soldier or a willing volunteer. It was a child. A boy of about 12, Edmund told me, his voice tight with horror. An orphan, purchased from one of the workhouses. They are going to do to him what was done to me, Eleanor. They are going to take a child and turn him into a weapon. I felt sick, literally physically ill, my stomach churning with revulsion. The thought of a child, innocent and helpless, subjected to the same agonies that Edmund had endured, was almost more than I could bear. I thought of my own childhood, of the safety and love my parents had provided, despite our poverty, and I understood with painful clarity how fortunate I had been. "Where are they?" I demanded. "Where is this laboratory?" Edmund unfolded a map on the library table, pointing to a location on the outskirts of London, in the industrial wasteland south of the river. "Here," he said, "an abandoned factory, converted for their purposes. My contacts tell me it is heavily guarded, surrounded by men who are paid very well to ask no questions." "Then we cannot go to the police," I said. "They would never authorize a raid on such flimsy evidence. And by the time we convince them, it might be too late." "No," Edmund agreed. "We cannot go to the police. We must go ourselves." I looked at him. This man I loved, this impossible creation of science and desperation and stubborn human will. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would follow him into that factory, into danger, into the very heart of the conspiracy that threatened to destroy us both. "When do we leave?" I asked. "Tonight," Edmund said. "If we are going to save that child, we must act now. Every hour we delay is another hour of suffering." We spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing. Edmund armed himself with weapons I had not known he possessed. Not just the blade hidden in his walking stick, but a small pistol designed to fire specialized ammunition that could disable clockwork mechanisms, and a set of tools for emergency repairs should his own body be damaged in the confrontation. He moved through these preparations with a calm efficiency that spoke of military training, of years of planning for exactly this kind of eventuality. For my part, I dressed in dark, practical clothing, abandoning the corsets and petticoats that would have restricted my movement, choosing instead a simple dress of heavy cotton that would allow me to run if necessary. Edmund showed me how to load and fire the small pistol he had given me, making me practice again and again until I could do it without thinking. "You may not need to use it," he said. "But if you do, aim for the center of the body. Do not hesitate. Do not give them time to react." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I had never imagined myself capable of violence, had never thought I would be the kind of woman who held a weapon and prepared to use it. But love, I was learning, changes everything. Love makes us capable of things we would never have believed possible. The factory loomed out of the fog like a nightmare given form, its broken windows staring down at us like empty eyes, its brick walls stained black with decades of soot. The building had once been a textile mill, Edmund had told me, before it was abandoned during one of the economic downturns that periodically swept through the industrial districts. Now it served a far darker purpose, and as we approached on foot, having left Edmund's carriage a mile away to avoid detection, I could hear the distant clanking of machinery, the hiss of steam, sounds that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Edmund was dressed for combat, if such a thing could be said of a gentleman. He wore a coat of reinforced leather over his waistcoat, and he carried a walking stick that I knew concealed a blade of the finest Sheffield steel. His mechanical parts were fully wound, he had told me, primed for action, and I had seen him practicing earlier that day, moving with a speed and precision that no fully human man could match. I, for my part, carried nothing but a small pistol that Edmund had taught me to fire in the gardens of Ashworth House, and a keen sense of my own inadequacy. I was not a soldier, not a fighter, not any of the things that might be useful in such a situation. But I was determined, and sometimes determination counts for more than skill. "There is a service entrance on the east side," Edmund whispered as we crouched behind a pile of rubble. "My sources say it is the least guarded. We can enter there and make our way to the main laboratory." "And then what?" I asked. "And then we improvise." He gave me a smile that was meant to be reassuring, but did not quite succeed. "Stay close to me, Eleanor. Whatever happens, stay close." We moved through the shadows like ghosts, avoiding the guards who patrolled the perimeter with the easy confidence of men who did not expect trouble. Edmund's mechanical eye, I discovered, could see in the dark far better than my human ones, and he guided me through the treacherous terrain of broken glass and rusted metal without incident. The service entrance was locked, but Edmund's mechanical hand made short work of the bolt, crushing it like paper. We slipped inside and found ourselves in a corridor that smelled of chemicals and something else, something that reminded me unpleasantly of a slaughterhouse. "This way," Edmund breathed, and we moved deeper into the factory. The laboratory, when we finally reached it, was nothing like I had imagined. I had expected something crude and makeshift, a temporary facility thrown together in haste. Instead, I found a space of gleaming white tile and polished brass, filled with instruments that hummed and clicked and glowed with the pale blue light of refined ether. It was beautiful, in a terrible way, and it took my breath away. But it was not the machinery that commanded my attention. It was the figures gathered at the center of the room. Half a dozen men in surgical aprons, their faces hidden behind masks, surrounding a table on which lay a small, still form, the child. I must have made some sound, some gasp of horror, because the men turned toward us in unison, and in the same instant, Edmund raised his walking stick and charged. What followed was chaos. Edmund moved like nothing I had ever seen, a blur of metal and flesh, his blade flashing in the ether light as he cut down the first two men before they could react. The others scattered, some reaching for weapons, others fleeing toward the exits, and I found myself standing frozen in the middle of it all, the pistol in my hand forgotten. "Eleanor!" Edmund's voice cut through my paralysis. "The child! Get the child!" I ran to the table, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own footsteps. The boy was unconscious, strapped down with leather restraints, and when I reached him, I could see the marks of surgery on his small body, incisions not yet closed, pieces of clockwork visible beneath his skin. "Oh, God," I breathed. "Oh, God, what have they done to you?" I fumbled with the restraints, my fingers clumsy with fear and urgency, and somehow I managed to free him, lifting his slight weight in my arms. He was so light, so fragile, his chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Behind me, the sounds of combat were dying down. When I turned, I saw Edmund standing amid the wreckage of the laboratory, his coat torn and his mechanical arm dented, but otherwise unharmed. The men who had been working on the child were scattered across the floor, some dead, some groaning in pain, none in any condition to stop us. "We need to go," Edmund said. "More will come." But as we turned toward the exit, a new figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking our path. He was elderly, with wild white hair and spectacles that magnified his eyes to an unsettling size. And he carried in his hands a device I did not recognize, a cylinder of brass and glass that pulsed with concentrated ether. "Going so soon?" Dr. Aldous Crane said, his voice mild and pleasant and utterly terrifying. "But we have so much to discuss." Edmund went rigid beside me. "Crane," he said, "I should have known. Should have, could have, would have." The old man smiled, and there was nothing benevolent in it. "The fact remains that you did not. And now here we are, in my new laboratory, with my newest subject in the arms of your charming companion. How delightful. Let us pass, Edmund said. I have no wish to kill you. Kill me? Crane laughed. My dear boy, you could not kill me even if you wanted to. I built you, remember? I know every weakness, every flaw, every point of vulnerability in your magnificent clockwork body. He raised the device in his hands, including the one I am about to exploit. He pressed something on the cylinder, and a beam of blue light shot across the room, striking Edmund squarely in the chest. Edmund screamed. It was a sound I had never heard from him before, a sound of pure agony, and I watched in horror as he crumpled to the ground, his body convulsing, his mechanical parts sparking and smoking as though some internal fire were consuming him from within. A modified ether pulse, Crane explained, walking closer. It disrupts the harmony between the organic and mechanical systems. Extremely painful, I am told, but not lethal. At least, not immediately. He turned his magnified eyes to me. Now then, Miss Ashford, I suggest you put down that child and step away from my creation, unless you wish to watch him tear himself apart. I looked at Edmund, writhing on the floor, his eyes rolling back in his head, his screams fading to whimpers of pain. I looked at the child in my arms, unconscious and innocent, his small body already half destroyed by the same madman who was now torturing the man I loved, and I made my choice. I raised my pistol and fired. The shot went wide, missing Crane by inches, but it achieved its purpose. The old man flinched, his concentration broken, and the beam of light flickered and died. In that instant, Edmund moved. He rose from the floor with a speed that should have been impossible, crossed the distance between himself and Crane in a single bound, and wrapped his mechanical hand around the old man's throat. You should not have done that, Edmund said, his voice barely recognizable, rough with pain and fury. You should not have hurt her. Her? Crane's magnified eyes darted to me, understanding dawning. Ah, I see. You have fallen in love with her. How delightfully human of you. He smiled, even with Edmund's fingers closing around his windpipe. But that is precisely your weakness, my boy. You were built to be beyond human limitations, yet you insist on clinging to human emotions. It is your greatest flaw. It is my greatest strength, Edmund said, and he squeezed. I will not describe what happened next. Some images are too terrible to commit to words, and some sounds are too awful to relive even in memory. I will say only that Dr. Aldous Crane, the man who had created the Clockwork Duke, died that night in the ruins of his laboratory, and that his death was neither quick nor merciful. When it was over, Edmund stood for a long moment, staring down at the body of his creator, his face unreadable. Then he turned to me, and I saw that the fury had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and something that might have been grief. Is the child alive? He asked. I looked down at the boy in my arms. His eyes were still closed, but his breathing seemed stronger, and when I pressed my fingers to his neck, I felt a pulse, steady and real. Yes, I said. He is alive. Then we have done what we came to do. Edmund held out his hand to me. Come, let us go home. We walked out of that factory into the cold November night, leaving behind the bodies and the wreckage and the shattered remnants of the Prometheus Society's ambitions. We walked back to the carriage that waited for us in the darkness, and we drove through the fog-shrouded streets of London, the child sleeping peacefully in my lap, Edmund's hand clasped tightly in mine. It was not the end of our troubles. The Prometheus Society had other members, other resources, and we knew they would regroup and try again. Inspector Harrow would have questions, difficult questions that we were not certain how to answer. And the child, when he woke, would need care and healing that neither of us was qualified to provide. But for that moment, in the rocking carriage with the man I loved beside me and a life I had helped save in my arms, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and adjustment. The child, whose name we eventually learned was Thomas, woke on the third day after our rescue, confused and frightened, but alive. The surgery that had been performed on him was incomplete, a mercy in its own terrible way, and the clockwork components that had been implanted in his body were relatively few and relatively simple. Edmund found a doctor he trusted, a woman named Elizabeth Sterling, who had trained in secret because the medical colleges would not admit her sex, and she was able to remove most of the mechanical parts without permanent damage. Thomas remained at Ashworth House while he recovered, installed in a bright room on the upper floor where he could look out at the strange mechanical garden and slowly learn to trust the people who had saved him. He was wary at first, as any child would be who had been sold by the very institutions meant to protect him. But children are resilient, and gradually he began to open up, to smile, to laugh at Edmund's mechanical tricks, and to follow me around the house with the devoted attention of a lost puppy who has found a new home. Edmund, meanwhile, was transformed. The act of saving Thomas, of preventing another child from suffering his own fate, seemed to have lifted some weight from his shoulders that I had not even realized he was carrying. He smiled more often now, laughed more easily, and when he looked at me, there was a warmth in his eyes that made my heart sing. But our happiness was tempered by the knowledge that the Prometheus Society had not been destroyed, only diminished. Dr. Crane was dead, but his secrets had not died with him. Someone, somewhere, had copies of his notes, records of his experiments, the knowledge needed to create more clockwork soldiers. And until we found and destroyed every last vestige of that knowledge, the threat would remain. It was Lady Rothmore who brought us the final piece of the puzzle. She appeared at Ashworth House one afternoon in early December, her black gown exchanged for one of deep purple, her severe expression softened by something that might have been relief. I admitted her myself, having seen her approaching from my study window, and I led her to the library where Edmund waited. "Lady Rothmore," he said, rising to greet her. "This is an unexpected visit." "I imagine it is." She took the chair he offered and folded her hands in her lap. "I have come to make a confession, Your Grace, and to offer an apology." "A confession? I was working against you." She met his eyes steadily. "When I approached Miss Ashford in the park, I was acting as an agent of the Prometheus Society. My task was to separate her from you, to isolate you, to make you vulnerable to their next attack. I felt a chill run down my spine. "You were one of them," I said. "I was." Lady Rothmore's voice was heavy with regret. "My husband was one of the founders. When he died, I inherited his position, his secrets, and his obligations. I told myself that I was serving a greater good, that the technology Dr. Crane had developed could change the world. But when I learned what they intended to do, when I heard about the child—" She broke off, her composure cracking for the first time since I had met her. "I could not be part of it anymore," she continued. Experimenting on soldiers who had already sacrificed everything for their country was monstrous enough. But experimenting on children? It was too much. I began working in secret to undermine the society from within. And when I learned of Miss Ashford's importance to you, I tried to warn her, to get her away before it was too late. Your warning nearly drove us apart, I said, and I was surprised by the sharpness in my own voice. If I had listened to you, if I had gone to that boarding house, Edmund would have faced that night alone. Yes, Lady Rothmore said. I know. It was a mistake, one of many I have made, but I hope I can make amends now. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a thick envelope. This is everything, she said, handing it to Edmund. Every name, every location, every record that still exists of Dr. Crane's work. The Prometheus Society is finished, Your Grace. With this information, you can ensure that it never rises again. Edmund took the envelope, his expression unreadable. And what do you expect in return? Nothing. Lady Rothmore rose to her feet. Only the chance to live out my remaining years without the weight of that knowledge on my conscience. She walked to the door, then paused, looking back at us. "You have found something rare," she said quietly. "Both of you. Something I never had and never will. Do not waste it." She was gone before either of us could respond. Edmund and I spent the next several hours going through the contents of the envelope. Lady Rothmore had been thorough. There were lists of names, maps of locations, detailed inventories of equipment and supplies. By the time we finished, we had identified 3 remaining laboratories, 2 in England and 1 in France, and a network of approximately 30 individuals who had been involved in the Society's work. "It will take months to dismantle all of this," Edmund said, surveying the papers spread across the library table. "Years, perhaps." "I know," I said, "but we have time." He looked at me, his mismatched eyes soft with an emotion I had learned to recognize as love. "We have more than time," he said. "We have each other." He was right. We had each other, and we had Thomas, who was growing stronger every day. And we had Ashworth House with its strange mechanical wonders, and we had the promise of a future that, however uncertain, was ours to shape. In the weeks that followed, we fell into a rhythm of life that felt almost normal, despite the extraordinary circumstances that surrounded us. Mornings were spent in the library, reviewing Lady Rothmore's documents and planning our next moves against the remnants of the Prometheus Society. Afternoons belonged to Thomas, who needed attention and care and patient explanations of the world he was only now beginning to understand. And evenings, the long, quiet evenings, belonged to Edmund and me alone. We would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in companionable silence, the intimacy between us deepening with each passing day. I learned the small sounds his mechanical parts made, the subtle whir of gears and click of springs that accompanied his every movement. He learned my moods, my silences, the things I could not always put into words. We were becoming, in those quiet hours, something more than 2 people who loved each other. We were becoming partners in the truest sense, 2 halves of a whole that neither of us had known was incomplete. One night, as I sat reading by the fire and Edmund worked at his small desk, adjusting some mechanism in his arm, he looked up and caught me watching him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I was thinking about fate," I said, "about the strange paths that led us to each other. If I had not been selected for the bonding ceremony, I would not have been out that night. If the Prometheus Society had not attacked you, you would not have been in that alley. If I had arrived at the ceremony on time, I would never have known you existed. Do you believe in fate, then?" Edmund set down his tools and turned to face me fully. "I do not know," I admitted. "I have never been one for grand philosophical questions, but I believe that the choices we make matter. I believe that who we are is shaped by what we do in the moments when it would be easier to do nothing. And I believe," she hesitated, "I believe that some souls are meant to find each other, no matter how unlikely the circumstances." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have spent 7 years believing that I was meant for nothing but solitude, that the man I had been died in that explosion, and that what remained was merely a shadow, a mechanical echo of something that had once been human. But then I met you, Eleanor, and you saw something in me that I had forgotten how to see in myself." "What did I see?" "You saw hope," he said. "You saw possibility. You saw a man, not a monster." I rose from my chair and crossed to where he sat, kneeling before him so that our eyes were level. "You were never a monster, Edmund. You were only ever a man who had been hurt, who had been used, who had been left to believe that he was unworthy of love. But you are worthy. You are worthy of everything good and beautiful in this world." He reached out and cupped my face in his hands, one warm and one cool, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward and kissed me, gently at first, then with increasing passion, and I felt something shift between us, some final barrier crumbling to dust. That night, for the first time, we did not part at the door of my chamber. That night, for the first time, We discovered that love is not merely an emotion, but a language, spoken in touches and whispers and the intermingling of breath. And when morning came, I woke in his arms, the ticking of his clockwork heart lulling me into a peace I had never known before. That night, as the fire burned low and the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, Edmund asked me to marry him. He did it properly, down on one knee, a ring held out in his mechanical hand, his human eye bright with nervous hope. The ring was beautiful, a sapphire set in a band of silver and brass, designed by Edmund himself in his workshop. It was not a conventional engagement ring. But then, nothing about our love had been conventional. "I know that society will not accept this," he said. "I know that the church will condemn it, that your reputation may suffer, that our children, if we are blessed with them, may face prejudice and cruelty. But I love you, Eleanor Ashford. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone or anything, and I am asking you, imperfect as I am, broken as I am, to be my wife." I did not need to think. I had known my answer since the moment I first took his hand in that dark alley, since the moment I chose compassion over ambition, love over safety, hope over fear. "Yes," I said. "Yes, Edmund, 1,000 times. Yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and then he rose and pulled me into his arms, and we stood there for a long time, holding each other, feeling the beat of his clockwork heart against my human one. Two impossible things made possible by the simple, stubborn power of love. The winter passed in a strange blend of domesticity and danger. We worked methodically through Lady Rothmore's documents, visiting the locations she had identified, confronting the individuals whose names appeared in her lists. Some surrendered quietly, relieved to be freed from the burden of their secrets. Others fought, and there were nights when Edmund came home with new dents in his mechanical arm, new scratches on his bronze face, and I would tend to him by the fire, polishing and adjusting, learning the intricate mechanisms of his body as intimately as I knew the contours of his soul. Thomas grew stronger with each passing week. The nightmares came less frequently now, and he had begun to show an interest in the mechanical workings of the house, following Edmund around the estate with endless questions about gears and springs and the mysterious properties of Aether. Edmund, who had never imagined himself as a father figure, took to the role with a tenderness that made my heart ache with love. One evening in February, as a storm raged outside and the three of us sat together in the library, Thomas looked up from the clockwork puzzle Edmund had given him and asked the question I had been dreading. "Will I become like you, Your Grace?" he asked. "Will the metal in me grow until there is nothing human left?" Edmund set down his book and met the boy's eyes with the gravity the question deserved. "No," he said. "The work that was done to you was incomplete, and what remains is stable. You will carry those pieces with you always, but they will not spread. You will grow and change as any boy does, and one day you will be a man, fully human in every way that matters." "But what if I do not want to be fully human?" Thomas pressed. "What if I want to be like you, strong and fast and able to do things that ordinary people cannot do?" Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "I would not wish my condition on anyone, Thomas. The strength and speed come at a cost that is difficult to explain. But I will tell you this, being human is not about what your body is made of. It is about how you choose to use it. And you, my boy, have already shown more humanity in your 12 years than many people show in a lifetime." Thomas considered this, his young face serious with thought. Then he nodded and returned to his puzzle, satisfied for the moment, though I knew the questions would return as he grew older and began to understand more fully what had been done to him. Later that night, after Thomas had gone to bed and the storm had subsided to a gentle rain, Edmund found me in my study, staring out the window at the darkened garden. "You are worried about him," he said, coming to stand beside me. "I am worried about all of us," I admitted. "We have come so far, accomplished so much. But sometimes I fear that it will all be taken away, that we will wake one morning to find that this was all a dream and we are back where we started, alone and afraid. Edmund took my hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to my fingers. "That will not happen," he said. "I will not let it happen. You cannot promise that." "No," he agreed. "I cannot promise that the future will be without hardship or sorrow, but I can promise you this. Whatever comes, we will face it together. And together, Eleanor, we are stronger than any force that might oppose us." I turned to look at him. This man who had been broken and rebuilt, who had suffered more than anyone should have to suffer, who had emerged from that suffering not hardened and bitter, but capable still of love and hope and joy. "How is it possible," I asked, "that you still believe in such things? After everything that has been done to you, how can you still have faith in the future?" "Because of you," he said simply. "Because you showed me that the world is not entirely dark. Because you taught me that even in the depths of despair, there is light to be found if one is brave enough to look for it." He cupped my face in his hands, one warm and one cool, and looked into my eyes with an intensity that took my breath away. "You are my light, Eleanor. You have been since the moment you knelt beside me in that alley and refused to let me die alone." I kissed him then, deeply, desperately, pouring into that kiss all the love and fear and hope that words could not express. And when we parted, we stood together in silence, watching the rain streak down the window, drawing strength from each other's presence. We were married in the spring in the small chapel on the grounds of Ashworth House, with only a handful of witnesses present. Dr. Sterling, who had become a dear friend, Inspector Harrow, who had proven himself an ally, Lady Rothmore, who had shed her mourning clothes for something almost cheerful, and Thomas, who served as ring-bearer with all the solemnity and pride a 12-year-old could muster. The ceremony was not recognized by the Church of England. No bishop would consent to marry a woman to a man who was half machine, no matter how many titles he held or how much money he possessed. But we found a minister of a smaller, more progressive denomination, a man who believed that love was love regardless of its vessel, and he spoke the words that bound us together with genuine warmth and conviction. I wore a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant, with a veil of antique lace that had belonged to Edmund's mother. Edmund wore his finest suit, the mechanical parts of his body polished until they shone, and when he lifted my veil and looked into my eyes, I saw in his face a joy so profound that it brought tears to my own. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, his voice steady and strong. "With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." The words were old, traditional, unchanged for centuries. But in that moment, spoken by this man who was like no other man who had ever lived, they took on a new meaning. A meaning that transcended convention and expectation and touched something eternal. We were married, truly married, in the eyes of God and in our own hearts, and nothing that the world could say or do would ever change that. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The Prometheus Society, though diminished, was not entirely destroyed, and we spent many months hunting down its remaining members and dismantling its lingering influence. Thomas, as he grew older, struggled with the legacy of what had been done to him, the small pieces of clockwork that remained embedded in his body, the memories of pain and fear that sometimes woke him screaming in the night. And I, despite my love for Edmund and my joy in our life together, sometimes felt the weight of society's disapproval, the whispers and stares and pointed exclusions that followed us wherever we went. But we faced each challenge together, Edmund and I, our partnership strengthened by every obstacle we overcame. We found allies in unexpected places, scientists who admired Edmund's unique physiology and wanted to study him for the benefit of humanity rather than its destruction, social reformers who saw our marriage as a symbol of progress and possibility, Ordinary people who looked past the scandal and saw only a man and a woman who loved each other with fierce, unyielding devotion. And in the quiet moments, in the late nights by the fire, and the early mornings in the garden, and the stolen hours in the library surrounded by books and dreams, we were simply ourselves, two people who had found in each other something they had never dared to hope for. I never regretted missing the ether bonding. I never wondered what might have been if I had kept walking that night. If I had let the fog swallow the sounds of a stranger's pain and continued toward my own narrow ambition. The life I would have lived, married to some stranger for the sake of security and respectability, seemed pale and hollow compared to the life I had chosen. Because I had chosen love, I had chosen courage. I had chosen to see the man behind the metal, the heart within the clockwork, the soul that no amount of brass and steel could extinguish. And in choosing him, I had found myself. Many years later, when my hair had turned gray and my joints had grown stiff and my face was lined with the evidence of a life fully lived, I sat in the library of Ashworth House, a book open in my lap, the fire crackling beside me, and I thought about all that had come before. Edmund was upstairs, resting. His mechanical parts required more maintenance now, more frequent adjustments and repairs, and he tired more easily than he once had. But his spirit was undimmed, his love as fierce as it had ever been, and when he held me in his arms at night, one hand warm and one hand cool, I still felt the same flutter of joy that I had felt on the night he first kissed me. Thomas was a man now, a doctor like Elizabeth Sterling had been, dedicated to helping others who had been harmed by reckless science. He visited often, bringing his wife and children to fill the old house with laughter and noise, and watching him with his family, seeing the happiness he had found despite everything that had been done to him, was one of the greatest rewards of my life. The Prometheus Society was gone, truly gone, its records destroyed, its members scattered or deceased, its ambitions consigned to the dustbin of history. No more children would be sold to mad scientists. No more soldiers would be rebuilt into weapons. The technology that had created Edmund still existed, in modified and controlled forms, used now for healing rather than harming. But the dream of a clockwork army had died in that factory on the night we rescued Thomas. I thought about writing it all down, all the things that had happened, all the choices I had made, all the love and fear and hope that had shaped my life. But I decided against it. Some stories are meant to be lived, not told. Some truths are too precious to commit to paper. Instead, I closed my book and rose from my chair and climbed the stairs to the room where my husband lay waiting for me. I settled onto the bed beside him, and he opened his eyes, his mismatched gaze finding mine with the ease of long familiarity. "Hello, my love," he said. "Hello, Edmund." He reached out and took my hand, his mechanical fingers interlacing with mine. It was a gesture we had repeated countless times over the years, a small ritual of connection and reassurance, and yet it never failed to move me. "Are you happy?" he asked, as he asked every night. "Completely," I said, as I said every night. "Are you?" He smiled, the same small surprised smile that had first captured my heart all those years ago. "Beyond measure," he said, "beyond anything I ever thought possible." We lay there in the darkness, listening to the ticking of his clockwork heart, feeling the steady rhythm of our breathing, two souls bound together by choice and chance, and a love that had proven stronger than metal or flesh or any force in the universe. And I knew, with the certainty that comes only at the end of a long and well-lived life, that I had made the right choice that night in the alley. I had missed the ether bonding to help a stranger. And the next day, the Clockwork Duke had sought me. And everything had followed from that single moment of compassion, that one decision to turn toward suffering instead of away from it. I would not have changed a thing.